Welcome to this session entitled Drinking Water Quality and Floodplain Management. My name is Councillor Keith Keating. I'm Eastern Director with the MNL Board of Directors. I'm pleased to introduce to you Paula Dawe and Deneen Spracklin, who will deliver this session. As of all our sessions, you can find more information and bios on our speakers and presenters on our website and in your booklets. Both Paula and Deneen are managers with Water Resource Division of the Department of Environment and Climate Change with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Welcome.
Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking around for this last session of the afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you about floodplain management, just kind of A to Z's, and what municipalities need to know with respect to floodplain management and floodplain mapping. So just to give you a bit of an outline, I'm going to talk about why do we have floodplain mapping, what's involved in a floodplain mapping study, how does floodplain mapping, once you have it, how does that impact your municipality, and how does floodplain mapping impact residents in your municipality? So first off, why do we have floodplain mapping in the first place? Well, there's different types of flooding that we see here in the province. So there's river flooding, coastal flooding from storm surge and waves. We also have urban type flooding and flooding sometimes from man-made structures, for example, if a dam fails. So the program that I run, we do not look at flooding from the ones that have been X'd out. What we look at is riverine flooding, coastal storm surge flooding, and there's a different section in our division that also looks at dam break flooding as well. So just to give you some stats on flooding in Newfoundland and Labrador. So the province, we have a flood event inventory. We have over 800 records of flood events in Newfoundland and Labrador in different communities going back to 1900. We have documented at least 37 deaths from flood and storm surge events since 1900. In terms of the costs of flood, so we have more reliable data from 2000 onwards, and flood damages cost at least an average of a minimum of $16 million annually. That's since 2000. And in terms of the communities that we have listed in our database that have experienced flooding, there's over 300, so 335 communities. So that's a lot of towns, local service districts, and unincorporated communities that have experienced flooding in our province. So a few more stats. Who's the floodiest of them all? Well, we have in our inventory, 56% of all flood events are in the eastern region. That's followed closely by the western region, and central has the least. In terms of the number of floods per year, we're averaging about 9 major flood events per year since 1900. Some years that's a lot more than others. I think when Igor tore through that, there were 70 flood events in individual communities. So it does vary from year to year. The majority of floods that happen in the province, 35% of them occur in winter. And then 31% have occurred in the fall. So those two seasons are when we see the most floods. And the majority of our flood events, 60%, are due to rainfall events. There's also other triggers for flood events such as storm surge, coastal storm surge, things like ice jams and snow melt. Those also trigger flood events. So we have over 300 communities that have experienced floods, but we only have 41 communities that have floodplain mapping that has been done for them. So this is an interesting graph in terms of the memory of floods fades from sort of the community after a period of about 7 years. That's what some researchers have found. So you have, in terms of what you call communicative memory is what people talk about. After 7 years, they kind of stopped talking about the flood that happened way, way back. Now, so you can't rely on that folk memory to protect your communities from extreme flooding. You have to document those flood events in terms of the area, the extent of the land that was flooded, and the damage that it caused. You have to keep that fresh in mind because it's going to happen again. And it's necessary to also think about that there's an increasing frequency of these flood events as a result of climate change. So this is going to keep happening, and it's going to happen probably at an increased frequency. So you can't forget about the floods that happened in the past. With respect to climate change, it is going to be, in a nutshell, it's going to be warmer, wetter, and stormier here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we're looking in terms of sea level rise. By the end of the century, we're looking at 100 centimeters sea level rise in some areas of the province. We're looking at a 12 to 33% increase in rain and snowfall by the end of the century. We're also looking at more variability in our precipitation and consequently the higher and low, more higher high flows and more lower low flows in our river systems. One of the things, what we're seeing is when you talk about a storm that's a 1 in 100-year storm. So that's what we're seeing now is a 1 in 50-year storm is now like a 1 in 100-year storm, because the probability of a storm of a certain magnitude happening is actually increasing. So here are some pictures just from recent flood events we've seen. So the one in the culvert there, that's along the Trans-Canada Highway. That was the atmospheric river that took out a bunch of the Trans-Canada Highway in, I think, 4 locations. Below that is Port aux Basques after Hurricane Fiona, and you can see flooding there in an area of St. John's and the corresponding precipitation amounts from Hurricane Earl. This is all these are all like major flood events that have happened since 2021. So this is my first sort of, I guess, solicitation for you guys. If your community has pictures of past flood events, I'd love to see them. If you guys feel like sharing, we're always continually working on our flood event inventory. So we'd like to, if you've got photographic evidence of those floods, we'd love to see those to add to our documentation. And you can see here some examples of past flood events. There's one from Brigus from 1905. One of the major flood events that happened in Badger in 1983, and then Port aux Basques with Hurricane Fiona in 2022. So what is involved in floodplain mapping? So we have, first off is, where does the money come from? The province has been involved in floodplain mapping since the 80s, and there was a federal Newfoundland flood damage reduction program that provided funding for a lot of flood studies. So between the mid 80s and the mid 90s, we got a number of communities covered with designated floodplain mapping. And over the years, the funding has sort of shifted around. Sometimes it's from the province. Usually it's in concert with a federal funding program. And right now, since 2022, it's called the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program. So basically the feds put up 50% of the cost and the province the other 50%, and that's how we pay for the flood studies. And we are expecting this program to extend into a phase 2, eventually a phase 3. So there should be sustained federal funding and provincial funding for flood studies in the next few years. So what goes into floodplain mapping? Well, if you look at floodplain mapping, it's almost like a burger. You can have different things on your burger, and the options of what can go on your burger over time have increased. So you're looking at things like what's the event likelihood that you want to map in terms of the flooding? Do you want to include climate change? What kind of topography or do you want to have LiDAR to have a digital elevation model for your area that's going to be flooded? Using satellite imagery to identify your land cover. Do you have any idea in your municipality of what your planned future land use is going to be? You can model that to see how that might affect your floodplain area. You can do infrastructure assessments to see, how, if we have these 1 in 100-year flows, are our bridges and culverts going to be able to handle those flows? We also do, or you can do what we call flood hazard mapping, which is more from an emergency management standpoint to understand depth and velocity and how dangerous certain areas of the floodplain might be from an emergency response. And the new sort of thing that we've added to the menu for your floodplain mapping is coastal storm surge and wave inputs into coastal flood mapping. So in terms of the process, the first thing we do is there has to be community participation. So the community has to be on board. They come to us and let us know, yes, we want to have floodplain mapping developed. The community then provides input in terms of if there's any history of flooding in that particular community. So that lets us know what water bodies we need to look at for mapping. We do a review of all the information. So is there any stream flow data or, are there dams in the watershed? So that it's any historical photography of dams and the extent of prior flooding. There's a field survey that gets done where people go out and they measure cross sections of those water bodies. They look at the size of culverts and bridges. So there's a lot of field work that goes into the flood extent mapping process. There we go. You look at the watersheds that you're mapping and the different characteristics. You then do, this is where the science starts coming in, or the engineering. You do hydrology work, which is coming up, what is the flow that you're going to look at in your models. Then you look at hydraulics, which is trying to convert those rainfall and flows into actual water depths, because that's what you're going to end up mapping. With respect to, if you include storm surge, then you're looking at hydrodynamics to kind of model the storm surge water elevation. And then you add things like sea level onto that, you add tides onto that, you add wave heights onto that. So that all gets put into the model in order to map your ultimate water level for coastal storm surge flooding. You then calibrate your models and your results. If you're going to look at climate change, you add climate change effects onto your 1 in 20 and 1 in 100 flood levels. Then you produce your mapping. So you get mapping for your 1 in 100 and your 1 in 20 annual exceedance probabilities for those flow levels. Then we go back to the communities and we verify the mapping with the communities. Does this look like what you've seen during past flood events? And if there might be certain areas that need to be, the model might need to be refined. So you go back and you fix that up. Then once everything is done, we, the minister, what we call it, we designate the floodplain officially under Section 33 of the Water Resources Act. The flood study and the mapping is published on our website, and that's sort of the process for flood extent mapping. So what do you get out of that from a municipality? Well, you get 1 in 20, 1 in 100 floodplain maps. You get 1 in 20 and 1 in 100 climate change floodplain maps. You get inundation depth and velocity mapping, and also hazard mapping. And then the report, the models, the data, all that goes is all also available to you. So if a model gets developed for your community, that's something that's posted on our website, or we can make available to the community as well. So this is an example of a 1 in 20 floodplain map. This is Shearstown. This is the 1 in 100 floodplain mapping. You can see the area covered grows larger. And this is a 1 in 100 climate change mapping. So again, more land area is covered by that, the by the floodwaters. With respect to climate change, what we have seen is that flows will increase between 17 and 37% with climate change. So this is why we're also looking at how climate change is going to affect your rivers and water bodies that could possibly flood in your communities. This is an example of the flood hazard maps. So the areas in red, those are kind of like the high danger areas where you have the deepest water and the water with the highest velocities. So if I think it's something like 30 centimeters of water that's moving at 0.9 meters per second, that's enough to sweep your feet out from under you and potentially sweep you away, and you could potentially drown. You probably saw it in the news where there were 2 volunteer firefighters in Quebec that died earlier this week. It doesn't take a lot of water to take your feet out from under you and get you in trouble. So it's very important to know where the danger areas are in your community from an emergency management point of view. So once you have your 1 in 20 flood risk maps and your 1 in 100 floodplain maps, you have certain areas defined now. So we call the 1 in 20 floodplain, they call that the floodway, and the 1 in 100 is your floodplain. So this is important from sort of a land use management and land planning point of view. So the province has a policy for floodplain management. And if a town wants to have floodplain mapping developed, they have to agree to abide by our policy for floodplain management. And what this does, it kind of sets out what you can and can't do in different parts of the floodplain. So the one that's probably of most consequence is that we do not allow residential development in a 1 in 20 year floodplain. It's too dangerous. There's too much of a risk associated with that type of development. Once a community develops floodplain mapping, they are then part of the process becomes to adopt it into your municipal plan, which generally your municipal plan has to be updated every 5 years anyway. So as part of that cycle, you would then incorporate your floodplain areas into your municipal plan, and you can have development regulations that follow along with our policy directive for floodplain areas as well. So in terms of the objectives of floodplain management policy is to prevent the loss of human life and avoid personal hardships. You know, when somebody gets flooded out of their home, that's a major hardship for somebody. We want to minimize damage to property and infrastructure because it's devastating for the people affected, but it's also the costs associated with it are incredible as well. We want to as well restrict activities which could degrade water resources. You want to maintain the natural capability of the waterways to convey flood flows. We want to minimize disruption to transportation and minimize the cost to taxpayers in the province. So if you have damage for flooding, there's certain programs that kick in that are taxpayer dollars that are funding people for recovery and whatnot. So if we can reduce that amount, that's more advisable. So once your floodplain mapping is developed, it's available on, so the studies, the maps, GIS files, it's all available on our flooding website for the Water Resources Management Division. We have a flood extent mapping application where you can go and see and find out, hey, is my property in a designated floodplain? And the flood mapping layer is also available on the land use atlas, the provincial land use atlas. So just to give you sort of an example, this is Portugal Cove St. Phillips. That is the Murray's Pond Country Club. You can see sort of where the flood lines are. And this is the flooding that occurred last year during Hurricane Earl, which pretty much matched where the flood mapping was drawn as well. So how does floodplain mapping affect or impact my town? So if you're a town and you've agreed to have floodplain mapping developed, that means you've agreed to follow the province's policy for floodplain mapping. So your town has accepted a trade-off between flood risk and development levels in your town. So, but it also means that you have reduced vulnerability to flood damage to property and infrastructure. So these are good things. You're reduced vulnerability to loss of life and injury. And in terms of the cost of emergency assistance and cleanup after floods will be reduced as well. So these are the benefits to you as a town if you adopt designated floodplains and you abide by development policies for those flood zones. In terms of land use planning, so it's smarter to leave the floodplain. The floodplain really, it belongs to the river. Just because there's not water on it all the time, the water will still expand into that floodplain area at certain times, depending on storm events and conditions. So it's best really to leave that floodplain undeveloped or to have low consequence developments such as parks or hiking trails, walking trails in those areas. It also means that you can, if you know where your danger areas are, you can develop in parts of town that you know are not going to be, where there isn't going to be flood hazard. Adopting the flood zones into your municipal plan is sort of part of the deal. So when the cycle kicks in where you have to update your municipal plan, there's a process for that. And that's initiated with the Department of Municipal and Provincial Affairs. As well, during that process, there's a whole public consultation that you have to go through. So that allows people who are in the floodplain to learn more about what it means to be living in a designated floodplain. Another thing a community can do is adopt a zero net runoff policies, which means that for any new development, you're not allowing any net increase in stormwater discharge into rivers and streams, which might increase the flood hazard. In terms of municipal infrastructure, if you have a flood study done, we're going to be identifying what bridges or culverts in your municipality are going to overtop and potentially cause road washouts. So those are the infrastructures you can now target through like capital works funding programs to upgrade. So we're gonna be able to identify where you're vulnerable, and then that means that you guys can plan ahead for those before those roads get washed out. In terms of, you can assess what buildings or other infrastructure could be in danger from flood hazards. The other thing is you might want to develop municipal stormwater drainage systems for your town. You might want to also look at reducing infiltration and inflow into your sanitary sewers so that your sewer systems don't surcharge or back up into people's homes. That's never a fun day for anybody. And you can also apply for capital works funding. That could also be for things like construction of flood mitigation measures. So maybe that's channelizing, putting dikes in around rivers or various other mitigation measures to protect against flooding. With respect to property assessments, assessed property values, they can be affected once a municipality has adopted a designated floodplain for their municipality. So that there are different factors that could affect an assessment, and it's really on a case-by-case basis. But if the land use zone changes, that could potentially affect the assessment, but it depends on how much of the property is in the floodplain and what you can and can't do in that for that particular property. As municipality, you can ask the municipal assessment agency to reassess the homes that are located in the designated floodplain. But this can also affect property values and may have an impact on property tax, so you're aware. So other things the town can do is raise public awareness for when you have newly developed floodplain mapping. Let people know that are in the floodplain, hey, do you know you're in a floodplain? So you have to create public awareness with those people. Refer any development applications or building permits that might be within the floodplain to us at the Water Resources Management Division, and we can have a look at them. You also want to incorporate your flood hazard maps into your emergency management plan. That's very important for communities to do. And just so you know, it's not the floodplain maps aren't static. They are periodically they should be updated because there might be, you know, climate change impacts the extent of the flood area that gets mapped, and that has been changing over time. So then how does floodplain mapping impact residents in your community? So floods impact people because they impact properties and they impact people's lives. So here we've got a picture of a car frozen in the floodwaters in Badger. We've got a home here, I think this is in Benoit's Cove, that's pretty much underwater. And you've got two gentlemen here being escorted by emergency workers out of a flooded home in Mount Pearl. This was just last year in September of 2022. So the big one people want to know is residents in your communities. Am I in a floodplain or not? So it's pretty easy. You just go to our land use atlas or our flood extent mapping application. You can look, you can search in your address and you can find out if you're in a floodplain or not. So that there's a property that's in a 1 in 20 year flood zone. So that's a kind of a concern. But here's another property that's only half of it's in the 1 in 100 year flood zone and half of it isn't. So it's important for people to know where they are, if they are in a flood zone. So just some common questions that we and comments we've seen from sort of the general public about flooding is like, do I have to move if my home is located in a floodplain? So no, any existing homes are considered grandfathers. Okay, it's not, they don't have to move. It's that there might be some restrictions on what they can and can't do on their property going forward. What if sometimes people don't agree that their property is actually located in a floodplain, but the mapping that's been developed has been developed by professional engineers. They're following industry standards, such as this is the part of the federal floodplain or flood mapping guidance series. But if there are any issues, the property owners can let the town or us or even the consultant know, and it can be flagged to be looked at for sure. What is the risk my property might flood? So there's a 5% probability that you may experience a flood in any given year if you're in a 1 in 20 year flood zone. There's a 1% probability that you may experience a flood in any given year if you're in a 1 in 100 year flood zone. So it's not that you have to wait 100 years. You could go 100 years and not have a flood, or you could go 5 years and experience 2 1 in 100 year floods. It's all about the probability in any given year. But just in terms of the risk, if you're looking at a home with a 30-year mortgage and that home is in a 1 in 100 year floodplain, there's at least as a minimum, there's a 26% chance that that home will experience a flood during that 30-year period. So that's sort of what your odds are. It is a gamble if you're in a flood zone. What can I do to protect my home against flooding? So property owners can use they can use flood proofing measures, and the province has a guidance document on how to flood proof your property that's available online. But the property owner is responsible for flood proofing their own property. Will I be able to get home flood insurance? So insurance companies, they offer different types of flood insurance. So there's ones for plumbing issues, for sewer backup, and overland flood insurance is available, but you have to ask for it. The other thing is you might not be eligible for overland flood insurance if you are located in a designated flood zone, or you could face the possibility of having your premium increased. Flooding that's caused by storm surge or tsunamis or tidal waves is not covered by insurers, just so you know, but it's best to check with your insurer in terms of what your coverage is. Will being in the floodplain affect the value of my home? So there are studies that have shown that properties that are located in flood zones sell for less and appreciate at a slower rate than properties outside of flood zones. And what do I do if my home is damaged or destroyed in a flood? Well, you should first contact your insurer to see if there's any coverage available to you. And if authorized by the province, specific emergency financial assistance may be eligible or may be provided to the eligible residents through the disaster assistance programs. But just so you're aware, disaster assistance only kicks in if the damages total up to, I think there's a minimum threshold of $1.7 million. So we've had floods that have been under that threshold where those residents were they got no disaster assistance. So that's a risk that you run living in a floodplain. So how does floodplain mapping help a homeowner? So like only 6% of Canadians are aware that they're living in designated flood prone areas. But once you know that you live in a floodplain, there are things you can do. So things like personal flood risk management. Are you comfortable with living in a floodplain or not? Should I be flood-proofing my property? You know, we have maps that will tell you what the depth of water is going to be at your property. So maybe you can put some flood-proofing measures around your property to protect it. And that lets you, in terms of financial planning for flood-proofing, that lets you know that that's something that you might have to consider. So just in summary, we need to protect the public from the risk of flood events. We need to make people more aware of their flood risk in your communities. We want to reduce the risk of flooding for both current and climate change conditions. We want to reduce the damages and disruption that are caused in our communities by flooding. And we want to look more at incorporating coastal storm surge and wave storm waves into our flood risk mapping program, because that's really where things are headed in terms of where the major risk of flooding is going to be is from coastal storm surge. So if your town is interested in getting floodplain mapping developed for your community, please reach out. Let me know. We keep a priority list of interested communities. And when we have money available, then you're up next, and we'll have a study for a floodplain mapping study for your community. So the thing is, there is a commitment that you as a community has to make, which is you have to agree to follow the province's floodplain management policy. So it's not, if you develop the mapping, you have to incorporate that into your municipal plan, and that has to be part of your considerations for land use planning. But again, contact me if your community has interest, you have flooding issues, and you would like to see flood mapping developed for your town. So just some useful links. We have a series of flood fact sheets that are developed for different audiences. One is for a community that doesn't have flood risk mapping. So it's a bunch of questions and answers on should our community get flood risk mapping. We then have a fact sheet for communities that have flood risk mapping and what should be their next steps, and for residents who live in a floodplain, so they know sort of in terms of public awareness of what that now means for them to be living in a floodplain. There's also an interesting video on our YouTube channel called "The Floodplain Belongs to the River." And that might be of interest to folks to kind of just understand a little bit more about flooding and flooding issues in Newfoundland and Labrador. And last off, so it's May 4th, so may the 4th be with you. So I think, I don't know, questions or?
Yeah, we'll have time after, if you want to answer them now or later on. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, all right, sure.
Hi, Paula. So you have spoke at the town of Portugal Cove St. Phillips. It's Jody Murray, CAO of the town there. And, we're still struggling with it, I guess, because the flood risk map was done in 2015 by the province, a year into a municipal plan. So we're only just adopting and just renewing our municipal plan going into next year. So I guess the question is, and there's still counselors who are really need the clarification on how municipalities deal with that interim of actually adopting it when you've got applications coming in that what the flood risk mapping is going to say, but you haven't adopted it yet, and you're doing approvals in principle based on old flooding. Like, where is that? What do municipalities do in the interim, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so it's a good question. But once the floodplain area is designated, it's also designated provincially. So whether it's in your municipal plan or not, you can just refer it to the Water Resources Management Division, and we have to go through the permitting process or like say yes or no to the development until you guys incorporate it into your municipal plans, and then you guys have that backstop once it's in your municipal plan. But until then, you can rely on us in terms of the provincial permitting process for floodplains. Anybody else? Okay.
Jason Young, Town Manager with the Town of Deer Lake. And just to follow up on that point, Paula, I think you and I have discussed, we have recently had applications come forward that were near the Humber River near our community. And we've actually had to utilize water resources actually for the new flood mapping that is not yet incorporated into our development regulations. But I got to say, water resources were very helpful. We've actually received a release now from the review, but those new maps have been utilized, but once again, have been available to the public, but will be incorporated in the future development regulations.
Yep. And again, if anybody, this is solicitation, and if anybody has pictures of flooding, please send them my way. Or if you're interested in having floodplain mapping for your community, feel free to reach out. And I think with that, I'll hand it off to Deneen.
Okay, thanks, Paula. So I guess I'm the last presenter of the day. Hopefully everyone can stay awake for this one. I'm here to talk today about drinking water quality and the path towards water treatment. I don't probably have to tell most of you about our drinking water quality issues throughout the province, but I'm going to start with just giving a brief overview, but going to mostly concentrate on talking about water treatment. And if you're actually interested in pursuing water treatment, what are the steps you should be taking prior to that, actually making that infrastructure decision. So just a bit of overview on what we face here in the province with drinking water systems. We've got about 471 public water supplies. So those are water supplies that are owned and operated by a municipality or a local service district. They're servicing about 366 communities throughout the province. Of those, almost 300 of them are surface water supplies. So we're looking at ponds, rivers, lakes, reservoirs when we're talking about surface water, and about 175 of those are groundwater systems. Some of those groundwater systems are quite small, just servicing a handful of homes within those communities. Most of our common water quality issues that we face here in the province include color, dissolved organic carbon or DOC, elevated levels of iron, manganese, arsenic, and other metals that could be in water. And of course, boil water advisories is another type of water quality issue that we commonly face here. When we look at treatment systems that are currently in the province, most communities are just utilizing disinfection. And for disinfection, they're mostly using chlorine or some form of chlorination system. Beyond that, very few are actually utilizing a more advanced treatment system. If you aren't aware of what your water quality issues are, we do publicly post all water quality data for any public water system throughout the province on the department's website. There's a couple of ways you can access that data through either the Newfoundland and Labrador Water Resources portal for all the historical data, or you can find the most recent data through links just on our web pages. When water quality data is added to our website, an email is sent out to all communities. So if you're not receiving that email, you can always get in touch with us to make sure we have the correct contact information or that it's going to the correct person in your community. So I just want to briefly go over the water quality issues I talked about here. So I've got this slide divided into surface water and groundwater systems. So surface water is on the left. For color, there's an aesthetic objective is the guideline value. So there's no health related impacts directly related to color in our water. So there's an aesthetic objective set for that, and it is 15 true color units. So on the left hand for surface water systems, that's the type of system that's really impacted by color. The red band there is showing the percentage of water samples that exceeded the aesthetic objective in a 3-year span for water samples taken from the source water. So right from your pond, lake, or river. So it's showing there about 80% of the samples taken within that 3-year span exceeded the aesthetic objective for color. Whereas for groundwater, we can see that the red band is quite small. Only 12% of those samples taken from groundwater systems exceeded the color guideline. Just another graphic showing color. This is just for surface water systems, since those are the type that tend to have issues with color. That red line that you can see that goes across the graph there, that's the aesthetic objective. So you can see the samples that are peaking above that line there. So some communities have quite large issues with color. We can see the max color that was indicated during that time span was about 280 true color units. Another key water quality issue, especially with surface water, is DOC, or dissolved organic carbon. There's no guideline value associated with DOC, but when we have organics in our water and we chlorinate, we can form disinfection byproducts. You've probably heard of THMs and HAAs before. So when we've got high DOC, that can contribute to a high level of the formation of those disinfection byproducts. So we can again see on the left-hand side showing surface water, the red band is showing about 77% of surface water systems have a high level of organics in the raw water. For groundwater, that again, the red band is going to be quite small. We've got a very small percentage, only about 7% of groundwater samples indicating a high level of organics. Most of it is in the very low to none for groundwater. If you see organics in groundwater, it tends to indicate that that well is under the influence of surface water, or there's probably some infrastructure issues there with the construction of your well. And again, just another graphic showing DOC. The red line that is showing there on the graph there is showing the high level of DOC. And so we can see that there certainly are some surface water systems that are peaking above that high level of DOC in our water. So I did briefly just talk about THMs and HAAs. Those are the disinfection byproducts. So for a lot of communities on surface water, this might be one of your key water quality issues. There is a guideline value of 100 micrograms per liter. And we can see again that red or pink color line is indicating the guideline value. And this is just a snapshot in time, this graph here. I'm not looking at the past 3 years, but this is for summer 2022, and it's the average. And so we can see that there are a number of samples that are above the 100 micrograms per liter for THMs. And then similarly, here's the other disinfection byproduct that we sample for, the HAAs. The guideline for this particular parameter is 80 micrograms per liter. And again, that's shown by that pink or reddish line on that graph. And so we can see what is peaking above there. This is again for summer 2022. A couple of other, I'm just going to some other water quality issues that your communities may be facing related to some dissolved metals or particulate metals that might end up in your water. One of them being manganese. This has become a bit of a bigger issue in the last couple of years since the guideline changed for manganese in drinking water. Previously, there was just an aesthetic objective, but back in 2019, Health Canada set a more of a health-related guideline of 0.12 milligrams per liter. So in this particular graph, again, we got surface water on the left and groundwater on the right, and we can see that both types of water systems experience issues with manganese. The blue band is the samples or the percentage of samples that are below even the aesthetic objective for manganese. The red band is showing between the aesthetic objective and the health-related guideline. And then the kind of orangey color, I believe it is, it's hard to see from here, is showing what's above the health-related guideline value. So important note from this is that both surface water and groundwater can be impacted by manganese. I'm just going to skip ahead just to save time. And then for iron, similar, it's another metal that can be naturally found in our drinking water sources, can impact both surface water and groundwater. Iron, the main concern is it has an aesthetic objective, so it can impair the aesthetics of our water, tends to cause color or even staining of laundry and plumbing fixtures. Iron gives you more of a reddish brown stain, whereas manganese on the previous slide, when we have staining from that, it will be more of a very dark brown, black type of staining that you might see on white clothes or plumbing fixtures. So as I mentioned, your drinking water quality data, not that I expect you to see all those numbers up there, but just want to reiterate, all the water quality data for public drinking water systems is available on our website. You can look up any community's drinking water quality data. Just go through the Water Resources portal or other links straight on our website. And again, if you don't know how to find that data, you can always reach out to our department to make sure that we're sending it to the right contact with your community. So that's kind of our main water quality issues that we're dealing with. Now I want to start talking about our treatment options. The most common approach to drinking water treatment is to have a centralized water treatment plant. So this is where we're treating all the water that is going out to your distribution system. So we're taking water from your source water, whether it be a pond, a well, a river. It's going to our treatment plant, then through our distribution system and into our household taps. So we're treating every bit of water that's being used by your community through the distribution system. Just an overview on these types of systems. We only have 22 full-scale water treatment plants here throughout the province. And when I talk about full-scale water treatment plants, I'm looking at what we call a conventional treatment plant that uses coagulant chemicals, clarification and filtration to remove the impurities from the water. Also talking about membrane filtration plants. We have some direct filtration plants as well as ozone filtration plants here in the province. When I'm referring to the 22 full-scale water treatment plants, I'm not talking about, we do have some other plants that are more parameter specific. So they may just be treating for arsenic, maybe treating for iron and manganese, but no other parameters. Or you could have some softening units that are removing hardness causing compounds like calcium and magnesium. I'm also not referring to just simple filtration plants like a sand filter or an activated carbon filter that doesn't have any other treatment steps with it. So the conventional treatment plants would be targeting the removal of all impurities from your water, not just one particular parameter, but would be giving you full compliance with all guidelines for drinking water quality. Another approach to water treatment are potable water dispensing units. So in this case, water is being taken from your source water. It's going to your distribution system, typically with just disinfection, being delivered into your homes. But then there's also a potable water dispensing unit building. So inside that PUDU is the acronym we use. There will be a treatment system. In this case, we're only treating water that's being used for drinking or cooking, and people have to go to that building, to the dispensing area, to collect the water that they need for those purposes. So we're treating a very small percentage of water in comparison to the centralized type of treatment that I talked about previously. We've got about 33 of these treatment systems across the province, and they all utilize multiple steps of treatment within those buildings. The one there on the left is a standardized design that was used for quite a few of the ones that are in operation. And they include sand filtration, ozonation, multimedia filtration, activated carbon filtration, membrane filtration, and UV disinfection. So multiple treatment steps to give very good water quality. So again, this is only treating water that people are collecting and using for drinking and cooking, and people do have to go to the unit to collect the water. Another approach to drinking water treatment is point of entry or point of use. So this is when the treatment options are actually in each individual building. So we can either treat the water as it comes into the building. So all taps within that building or house will receive treated water. That would be point of entry. And then point of use is when we have the individual treatment units on a tap or underneath the tap. So it'd be more of a household type of approach to treatment. There's various types of options out there for point of use, point of entry, things like granular activated carbon filters. So similar to like a Brita type of filter, reverse osmosis. So that's a type of membrane filtration, UV disinfection. So depending on the water quality that's coming into that individual building, you would have to choose which type of treatment would be appropriate. But there are certainly things that need to be considered if you're looking at point of use, point of entry. Who's going to pay for the installation? Is it going to be private, each individual homeowner that's going to have to install that? Could you do it on a community-wide basis? Who's going to be responsible for the replacement parts? Like with any treatment unit, it will have to be maintained. So often with these point of use, point of entries, you swap out cartridges, swap out membrane filters. A couple of things also to consider that the treatment units will have to be NSF certified. That means they're for use with potable water, and they need to be certified for the parameters that you are trying to remove from that, from your drinking water. Not all point of use, point of entry options are going to be equal. So you need to make sure that the one you're choosing is going to address your water quality problems. So all three approaches, conventional, the centralized, the PUDUs, and the point of use, point of entry, all have benefits, all have negatives. So when a community is looking at what their water quality issues are, they need to look at what the positive and the negatives are of each approach. When we look at centralized treatment, we have to treat everything going through our distribution system, which can be quite costly because you're treating all the water people are using. But of course, it's giving everybody full access to that completely treated water because it's going to your distribution system. With PUDUs, you're getting super treated water, but people have to go collect it in their own containers. That adds a lot of challenges depending on your community. If you have aging residents or anybody who has physical mobility issues, it can be quite hard, or even if you don't have access to a vehicle, it can be quite hard to collect water when you have to go to a unit to fill up a container. So it may not be equal access, but you are able to reduce your capital costs, your operation and maintenance costs, because you're just treating a very, very small percentage of the water that's being used by your community. And like I said, there's point of use, point of entry is a bit of a new approach when we're talking about public water systems. There are, St. Anthony has started a pilot project in partnership with government on point of use filtration, just at its early stages. So it's kind of a new approach to treatment being discussed at the community-wide level, but could be an option for really small communities where the capital costs associated with water treatment plants just might not be feasible, or maybe it's the operation and maintenance that would be challenging, and the point of use, point of entry might be a better option. But like I said, they all have their positives and negatives. To help communities, so if you are in a community that has water quality issues and you are really interested in looking at treatment options, there is a tool available on our website called the Full Cost Accounting Assessment Tool. It was developed under one of our boil water advisory reduction initiatives to try and help communities figure out what an appropriate water tax should be for their community. So in the behind the scenes of this full cost accounting assessment tool are a bunch of capital cost curves and O&M cost curves. So you can enter all the data for your community that related to your water system, kind of like your asset management plan, but then you add in some financial data associated with operating your water system. And it will give you, it will let you know if the water tax or water fees that you charge in your community are allowing you to see a full cost recovery. So ideally, the amount that you're charging for your water should be enough to fully cover the cost of operating and maintaining your system. So the full cost accounting assessment tool will help you figure out if your water tax is appropriate, or it will let you know where you are in terms of achieving full cost recovery. The other handy part of this tool is that if you are interested in upgrading your system, you can use this tool to enter that infrastructure data, what you want to upgrade to, and it will give you more of the financial implications of making those upgrades, what impact it would have on your water rates. Or if you're looking at replacing infrastructure, adding treatment, you can do similar things. So it gives you kind of an approximate financial implication of making those upgrades or adding extra treatments steps. So on our website, the full cost accounting assessment tool is just an Excel spreadsheet where you enter all your data. There's also a user manual and instructional video that was just added last year to help with the use of the tool. And then we also added a small system questionnaire for anyone who's not comfortable using Excel or maybe just wants to take a quicker route. You can fill out the questionnaire and then just get in touch with our department and we'll work through the Excel spreadsheet and provide you with the results from that. So it's a great tool if your community is looking at treatment, just to get some approximations of costs. It was updated a couple of years back because prior to that, what we were seeing was especially the O&M costs, the annual O&M costs associated with operating a water system. This tool kind of over approximated and gave users a bit of sticker shock, and maybe they weren't really trusting it. So a couple of years back, we did get a consultant to look at the tool and revise some of the behind the scenes cost curves to give us a bit more of a reliable approximation in terms of cost. So I've got the link there to where you can find the tool, or you can just reach out to our department. So if your community is really serious about looking at centralized treatment, so you want to treat all the water going into your distribution system, the first step in the process before you even start filling out applications or looking at different types of water treatment is you got to first look at your water usage. Get an idea of your flow rates, because we use a lot of water in this province. Theoretically, we should be using about 340 liters per person per day. That's that red line you see in the bar graph there. And then the blue bars are actually data from Statistics Canada that shows water usage in our province. So you can see that we're showing double, if not more, water usage. So if you are looking at centralized treatment, remember you have to treat all the water going through your distribution system, regardless of what it's being used for. So even the water that people are using to water their lawns, wash their cars, melt snowbanks, is all being treated, and you've got to pay for that treatment. Even the numbers there from Statistics Canada showing between 700 to 800 liters per person per day in data that has been provided by communities directly to the department, we're actually seeing higher rates of usage, even above 1,000 liters per person per day. So that's a lot of water. That could just may not be people using the water. It could be water that's leaking out of our aging water systems into the ground. But again, if you're looking at centralized treatment, you're going to be treating all that water regardless of how it's being used. So before we will even issue a permit to construct for a water treatment plant, we will look very closely at water usage data, and it will need to be minimized. Otherwise, not only are you paying to treat all that water, you have to pay for a much larger treatment plant because it's going to have to treat that full capacity. Even if we look at the water we use, this pie chart here is showing average residential indoor water use. So we're not even looking at water that we use outside. This is just inside our homes. And about 10% of the water we use inside our homes is actually water that we're drinking or using for cooking. Most of our water inside our homes is being used for bathing, showering, toilets, laundry. So really uses where we don't need that super treated water, but we still, if we're using centralized treatment, we're treating for all these purposes regardless. So Again, something to really look at closely if you're looking at centralized treatment. So flow monitoring records, have a look at how you're tracking your flows in your communities. If you're doing automatic flow monitoring, that's great. It's going to give you the best data, especially if you're getting daily totalized flow records. When you're looking at designing a treatment plant, we're going to need that daily totalized flow. We're going to need data like maximum day flow and also peak flows. So those peak instantaneous flows, all that data is going to be needed for the design of any water treatment plant. So we would want to see a minimum of 1 year of good quality data. The more, the better. And when I talk about good quality data, it needs to be that, you've confirmed the units you're writing down. Automatic recording is going to give you the best data. But if you have to do manual recording, that means your operator's going into the water plant every day, taking a reading, manually writing it down. It opens up the, for errors in writing down the numbers. Are you going at the same time every day to do that reading? So the best quality data will give you the best results for your water treatment plant. If you're having any issues with flow monitoring, our department offers a number of different resources. When it comes to flow monitoring, we have on-site training from our operator trainers. They're based out of St. John's, Grand Falls, and our office in Corner Brook would cover Western Newfoundland as well as Labrador. So we do have a curriculum for flow meters. We also have one for leak detection. So if you feel a lot of your water usage is because of leaks, then we do have leak detection training where we can train your operators on how to locate leaks. We also have a standard operating procedure on flow monitoring and recording. And we also have a lot of record keeping templates that we can help communities with, making sure that they're collecting the right data. Also, if there's a lot of resources out there for water conservation. So if you do see that your water usage rates are really high, there's lots of data out there. We have a web page with some tools and resources for water conservation. Other jurisdictions like other cities and towns across Canada have developed some quite sophisticated water conservation public outreach materials. So, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here for water conservation. We can educate our residents using these other resources that have already been developed. But you can reach out to us for those links, both to our website and other jurisdictions. Water meters, which are sometimes a hot button issue. We do not use enough water meters here in our province. Any other jurisdiction in the country, you're going to see residential water meters so communities can closely track where all their water is going. Other than some pilot projects for residential water meters, I'm not aware of any community that is doing residential water metering community-wide. So it really leaves you with very little information on where your water is going. I know a lot of residents are very hesitant to go down the water meter route, but it is going to give you the best data and it's going to allow you to keep a tight system when it comes to water usage. And leak detection, again, is another big thing. I mentioned it for one of the training sessions we offer, but leak detection shouldn't be just handled when you see a leak happen or your water usage spikes. Leak detection should be regular operation task in your water system. So you should be proactively doing leak detection every year to minimize those losses through just cracks and infrastructure deterioration in your water system. I think this leak detection is a great way for communities to work together. You don't all need leak detection equipment because you're not doing it every day, and it can be quite costly to have this equipment, but you can certainly share it and you can share resources because you do need more than one person to effectively do leak detection. So it's a great way for communities to cooperate both between the equipment and the staff to do the leak detection. The more you do it, the better operators are going to be at detecting these leaks. So another great way to reduce your water usage. So water usage, knowing what your flows are is going to be really your first step. If you're even thinking about water treatment, is can we even do it? Are we using way too much water to look at centralized water treatment, that should be your very first step. And if you are using way too much water, start trying to reduce that water usage, whether it's through public education, leak detection. Even if you're not doing residential water meters, make sure any commercial businesses, institutions within your community have water meters that will at least give you some idea, or maybe even zone meters. Pressure monitoring can also help with this. So there are ways you can do it without residential meters, but make sure you start working on reducing those water usage rates if you're really serious about treatment. The next thing to look at is water quality data. As I mentioned previously, we do have water quality data publicly available on our website for all public water systems. Most of this data is going back to 2000 or even before for our public water supplies. But if you are looking at water treatment, it could be a good idea to even collect more data. We want to maximize the amount of source water data. So when our department is out collecting water samples from each public system, we're doing your raw water sampling. So right straight from your pond, river, lake, groundwater well. We're doing that usually every 3 years, but tap water samples, which is those are the data that is regulated. We're doing that on a quarterly basis for most systems. So when you're looking at water treatment, it's the raw water data, the source water data that is really important. So we want to make sure we've got representative data for your community that's showing us worst case scenarios. So our data may not always be hitting those worst case scenarios. So if you're looking at water treatment, it's time to start collecting some additional data. I know one community that is working towards treatment right now has started doing monthly source sampling on the supply that they're looking at using to add treatment. So the more data, the better, and the more representative, representing those worst case scenarios is going to give you the best outcome once the water treatment plant is built. And this graph here is just to show how water quality can certainly change over time. This is just showing the seasons here. So we can see the first two there are showing summer and fall. And this is just related to color. This is just an example. So we can see how color can fluctuate throughout the year. It can be impacted by things like heavy rain, snow melt, spring runoff, anything that could be increasing color, even wind events. So in this scenario here, it's showing our source water sampling for over a 3-year period. And we're seeing how color has peaked throughout the summer and fall seasons, a little lower in spring and winter. But it does show how we need to make sure that we're getting representative water quality data throughout different seasons, throughout different weather conditions, to make sure we're hitting those worst case scenarios. And even when we look at different types of water systems, so rivers and streams tend to have more fluctuating water quality than a large lake or pond. Water quality in a river can change minute to minute, especially during heavy rain events. So we want to make sure that if you're looking at treatment, that we're getting good water quality data to make sure that the engineers who end up designing your plant have the best data for when we get to that point. And I finished early, so that's your treat for the day. Any questions on anything I went over there?
Yeah, Keith Billard, Flowers Cove.
Yes.
Northern Peninsula. I don't know if you remember, I met you two girls, was a third person, 27th of February, 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I asked for that meeting was 2 articles in the paper. One was in the Telegram, the 10th of December, 2018. And it said municipalities minister raises drinking water red flag for numerous small towns in the northern area, byproducts. And the second one is Wednesday, February the 6th, 2019, and that's what you intimated to about St. Anthony, along with the source water coming into the house after using filters. And it was on a 90-10 basis. And the reason for that was certainly in the meeting I had with you guys was about the HS, you know? Yeah. It talks about the THMs and the HAAs, right?
Mhm.
And how that causes carcinogens and it's provide overuse of chlorine, supposedly. Have you figured out what's that all about? And is there any other community using those filters on a 90-10 basis, like St. Anthony's doing, where they put it in a house, and after that, so long, the filter gets bad, the house owner has to replace the filter.
There recently is a community that's looking into it. There's no one that has it installed on a community-wide basis yet, but we've had meetings with communities recently between municipal infrastructure with the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. They're the funding organization. There's been discussions between them and a community and us with regards to point of use. And that came from an original proposal they had put in for more community-wide treatment. And then in that case, the treatment that was proposed for them, which I didn't really talk about, I alluded to not including simple filtration systems when on my slide, when I talked about the number of treatment plants. And for these kind of simple filtration systems, like a sand filter or multimedia filter that are being proposed to a lot of communities, they're not going to address your water quality issues on a long-term basis. So a lot of communities are being approached or giving proposals for these filtration systems that are not going to work on a long-term basis, may work very short-term, but are still not going to give you full treatment. So in discussions with that particular community, we did bring up, what about point of use, point of entry as an option? Because this particular community had less than 100 residents. A water treatment plant can be a huge burden for a community of that size, not only the capital cost, but the ongoing O&M. So that one's still under discussion, but I think it is a really good opportunity because it's a community of the right size to take the point of use of point of entry approach in terms of the capital costs, the O&M costs, and just, the ongoing burden to that community. So it's still early stages. I think there's still a lot that has to be figured out about liability in terms of who ends up being the owner of that system. Would it be the community or would it be the homeowner? How do you make sure homeowners are replacing the units when they need to be? So there are still a lot of questions, but I think there is a lot of positivity about that approach for a lot of our communities. Any other questions?
What would it cost for a good plant? Take everything out of the water.
Surface water? Surface water, like, are you on a pond? On a brook? Yeah. How many people? 600. I'm really not the cost person here, and costs certainly have increased, but you are looking at, millions of dollars.
We're getting 1.45 million.
Mhm.
What's that going to do?
What has been proposed? So obviously something was to get,
We gotta dig out for engineer.
yeah, but to come up with that number, something must have had to been proposed to get that quote. If you come to me and you show me that proposal, I can let you know if it's garbage or not.
Not garbage for us. We got 100,000.
Well, I can tell you what whoever gave you that quote, if what they quoted was appropriate or not. We can tell from the 22 water systems that are working in the province. We can at least give you a short list of what technologies will work.
I'm toward the Carnival plant a couple times.
Yep, and it's a great plant. Yep.
Good day, Derek down here, Town of Grand Bank, Councillor.
Yep.
Quick question, I guess, regarding the reporting of the water sampling. I've done some research, I guess, investigating on our water supply and results, and I noticed like it's August 30th, June 14th.
Yeah.
Is that the actual date the sample was drawn?
If that's the date that's next to your data there, yes, then that would be the date it was collected. Yep.
Okay, so the other, I guess, for that reporting period.
Yep.
That's just that snapshot in time then, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay,
So we take grab samples. So it would, you fill up the full bottles. There's a number of bottles on that day. And we do it by seasonal basis. So we have our water sampling season separated, winter, spring, summer, fall.
okay. So I noticed on like all of our reports here for our town, it seems like whenever our chlorine levels are high, our THMs are also high.
Yeah.
And of course, when it's chlorine is low, THM's low.
So how it works is that when you've got water that has organics in it, natural organic matter, which when we have a pond, a lake or a river, it's going to have organics in it because the organics are coming from, decomposing, plant material, other organics around there. So throughout the year that the level of organics is going to fluctuate depending on the season. We tend to see the highest level of THMs and HAAs forming in late summer into fall when you've got more of that plant material decomposing. So when you've got the organics and then you add chlorine, you are going to get THMs and HAAs forming, those two ingredients there. You need to take one of them away to keep these disinfection byproducts from forming. So we know the importance of chlorination, of disinfection for, the acute risk to our water from microorganisms. So through treatment, through those centralized treatment plants, what we're doing in those is we're removing the organic matter. And most of that organic matter is dissolved. It would be easy if it was all particulate. You could throw it through one of those simple filters and it would filter it out, but most of it's dissolved. And that's what makes it so complex to get it out. We need to use methods like membranes that have really tiny pore sizes, or a conventional plant where we use a chemical to assist us in getting it out. So it's the natural organic matter in our water that is the complex part.
The other question I guess I got is like, for our town, we got a shared water system in town of Fortune.
Yeah.
My understanding, I've just come on council last year, November, so I'm not right up on it all. But my understanding is that the water is treated at, I guess, the Fortune site, chlorinated, and we also have a solar ash plant there.
Yep.
Then when the water flows to Grand Bank, I think we're adding more chlorine. So I'm wondering, is Grand Bank not getting too much chlorine?
So for the whole part of the booster system, so like if we didn't have that booster, they would end up having to add more at the start. So you're adding more chlorine, you're giving it more time to react with all your organic matter. So booster stations is one way that we call it chlorine demand management. It's one way we can reduce the formation of your THMs and HAAs. At the start, we only add enough chlorine to get to your booster station, and then they kind of will boost the level again. So it is one approach that can be done for managing chlorine.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? We're almost out of time.